Hi, my name is Kevin Deegan-Krause, and I'm a member of the Ferndale Board of Education. And I've been asked to talk to the community about how Michigan funds its schools, which is a good topic and a long topic because Michigan school funding is incredibly complicated. And so what I want to do actually is to start out by getting everything on the table and asking all of you in your head or on paper if you wish to do what we do in Michigan when we want to test how well people know, that we give them high stakes multiple choice tests. So here is a high stakes multiple choice test for all of you on how Michigan funds schools. All right, first question. What kind of taxes fund our schools? So if you don't have a paper, just think of the answer in your head. There'll be 3 questions in this series, so think of the answer in your head. Is it property taxes, income taxes, or sales taxes? I feel like a game show host at the moment. Second, which government funds them? Is it local, federal, or state? And are the funds distributed according to individual districts? Do they go to schools, or do they follow individual students? All right? Everybody have, I did and I didn't. I did and I didn't stack the deck. So does everybody think they have answers to this? Anybody want to make a guess on the first one? How are they funded?
C.
C, excellent. Second one, which government funds them?
C.
C, the state. And how are the funds distributed?
C.
C. Almost. Almost. Now, some people, especially those who've been living in the state a long time, might have been tempted to respond this. All right, this is how Michigan used to fund its taxes. And if you talk to people, there are still people and children of people you meet who've been around here for a long time who think that this is still the basic way of doing it. And in fact, this is the way that most states fund their schools. So if you've come from another state, you might well expect that this is how Michigan funds schools. If you lived here a long time and didn't follow a lot of things, this is how you might expect it. Even then, it wasn't pure. This was sort of mostly the way. There was always a little bit of state and federal funding. There were some that followed students and districts and so on. But this is the way we used to do it. As this intelligent crowd figured out, this is how we do it now. Mostly. Mostly sales, mostly state, mostly by people. Because in fact, the answer is my favorite answer in these kinds of tests. It's really all of the above. Now, it's all of the above to varying degrees, but this is the current situation of Michigan funding for education. It is every category and every. Now, some are more than others. This area tends to be more than the others, but not always, not in every circumstance. So what I want to talk to you about is that remarkably complex situation in Michigan funding. And what I want to try and do is to do it in as nonpartisan, non-argumentative a way as possible. My day job is to teach at Wayne State. I teach in political science there. And my academic training is to approach every question with as much scrutiny as I can, especially if it's a business that I agree with, then it gets extra scrutiny. And so my job here is to talk to all of you about how Michigan funds schools, and I'm trying to get to answers that pretty much everyone could agree with. There is one question, however, which is both simple and complicated, and it's the question of how funding has changed over time. Now, you may wonder what the answer is here. If you watched the Super Bowl, you would have been told that there was a particular answer. If you didn't watch the Super Bowl, you might be inclined to think that there are other answers. As far as I can tell, and this is something I'm going to go into a lot more depth in, the answer to this last question is C. That there are very few ways that you can look at funding in education over the last 10 to 15 years, even over the last 4 to 5 years, and say that education funding is up. You have to ignore a lot of factors. You have to start at a certain baseline, and so on. And so you'll see this line that sort of cuts through the presentation. It's not just a sort of awkward visual element that I couldn't draw. What it is actually is the foundation allowance for the Ferndale schools over the past 14, 15 years. It's this particular line. I'll get into that in a minute. The big points, if you do nothing else, if the people watching TV turn off right now, this is what I want you to know about school education, education funding in Michigan. There isn't as much of it as there used to be. Localities like ours don't have much control, if any, and it is so remarkably complicated that it's easy to dispute these things unless you look very closely because of the complexity of the system. So you can always add up numbers in particular ways or move numbers around in particular ways to find particular answers. This is certainly true, and these from a pretty close look at the numbers, seem to be true as well. So that's what I want to talk about. And then there are 4 questions that I actually want to deal with in specific. First question is, how has funding changed? I'm going to talk about that for about 5 minutes. Actually, I'm going to talk about 2 parts of this. One for about 5 minutes, one for about 15 minutes. And then for about 4 or 5 minutes each, I'm going to talk about why funding's changed, why you should care, and what, if anything, you can do. I'm not going to focus a lot on these because I want to stay to the question simply of how it's changed, but I'll at least bring up those issues and we can talk about them as a group. So let's start with the first question, how it's changed. And there are really 2 parts of this question. When we say how can have 2 meanings. One can mean how in terms of the amount, and the other can mean how in terms of the way we do it, the method that we do it. So let me start with the amount. And as far as I can tell, everything I've seen, with a very, very few exceptions, suggests that there is less of it. There's almost certainly less of it over the last 10 years, and even over the last 4 or 5 years, it's pretty clear that funding is smaller than it used to be. There is less money coming in to schools and less money available, in particular for classroom education. How do we know? Well, this line right here is the per pupil allowance for the Ferndale School District, the school district that I think all of you live in. These are the statistics from the Michigan Department of Education, and these are in raw dollars. So the statistics online start in 2000. At that time, Ferndale's number per pupil was about 6,800. Now, Ferndale's number is about 7,700, about 7,758. It's proposed to move a little bit higher to about 7,850, something like that, in the next budget cycle. But this is what we see. If education funding has risen by a straight 2%, it would look something like that. If it has risen as fast as inflation, it would look something like the gray line that's there. And so it's interesting to see, if nothing else, that if you just look at education funding compared to inflation, education funding went up faster than inflation through about 2003. And after 2003, it's lagged inflation in every single year. It's fallen below inflation at every single point. At certain points, not only did it lag inflation, but it actually decreased in raw numbers. So that the actual dollar signs, the number of dollars that were coming in, were smaller, and those dollars were worth less. So one better way to do this, actually, is to control for inflation. So we turn that inflation into a flat line. So this is what money's worth at any given time, and this is the actual amount that we see. So if you start with the numbers beginning in 2000, I would have gone back further, but those numbers aren't available from the state, at least not in an easily translatable form. If you start in 2000 when the numbers are there, not even at the peak, just right there, what we've seen is about a 15% decrease through 2014. If we go to the next year, the projected, both the governor's projected budget and the projected inflation figures, it's actually almost identical. It's even a little bit larger than 15, depending on what inflation actually turns out to be next year. So what we've seen in Michigan is a 15% decline in per pupil funding, at least what we've seen in Ferndale, the Ferndale School District, a 15% decline in per pupil funding over the past 14 years. Now, one of the problems with this is that there are lots of different ways of calculating it. So you can use per pupil funding, you can use total funding, you can use all sorts of different things. So I'm not satisfied. Just because this is what we see in Ferndale, this isn't the only source of revenue that the district gets. It's also not the only district in the state, so I don't want to leave it there. I want to go to some other sources. So I want to take 2 sources in particular. One of them that I got just yesterday, and so it's not in a format that I'm really excited to show you, but I'll walk you through it, and the other one actually looks a lot better. So one of the sources that I'm going to use is the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. Has anybody dealt with this group or seen this group? Pretty good organization, founded by a bunch of public policy experts that generally seeks a kind of nonpartisan position. Now, you can argue back and forth, but at least that is their goal. And they put out a report in May 2013. And then they followed it up. I actually sent them an email and said, do you have the more recent numbers? So they sent me the more recent numbers without the newest budget numbers, but at least with last year's budget numbers. So if we add these up to 2013, this is what we get. And what they've done, which is different than what I've done with the Ferndale numbers, is to break them up into 3 categories. So this green line here that's labeled MIPSers, which is a really awkward acronym, but you hear it quite often, increasingly, which is the acronym for the Public Employee Retirement System. This is the teacher pension program. So this is MIPSers. This actually is also MIPSers, But this small triangle here reflects additional funds that the state is introducing to help fund MIPSers. Even without that, this line for MIPSers is increasing slowly over time. So the amount per pupil that we're spending on teacher retirement is increasing over time. In part because right around here, a lot of retirement systems, including this one, took a big hit at the market level, so there are unfunded liabilities in terms of pensions going on forward, but also because with the expansion of charter schools and other kinds of schools in Michigan, where new teachers don't have to participate in this system, you get an imbalance in the number of people who are receiving pension payments and the number who are actually paying in. With a steady state system, you get people paying in and people using it. What you're getting now is a shrinking number of people paying in because a lot of people at these other schools are not paying in, but the same weight that you have to pay out at the other end. So pension costs are increasing. So this increase, this expansion, is partly because of the market and partly because of state decisions about how teachers are required or not required to participate in that pension program. If you then look at what's left over and what's available, you see in raw dollar terms, it actually seems to increase slightly and then decrease. But if we control for inflation again, what you see is that exact same group. And the available funds are considerably smaller once you take the pension funds away. So not only have the numbers fallen, but the remaining numbers are less available for classroom education because lots and lots of them are now going to the pension system. So you see a drop when you measure it this way. The final one, and this I apologize for. I hate it when people do this, but I just got this data yesterday from Jim O'Donnell, who's our school board chair. This is actually from the House Fiscal Agency. So this is the body in the state that is responsible for making estimates like this. And if you follow it across, you'll see that they do the exact same kinds of calculations. Their baseline starts in 2005, and they calculate as the school aid fund per pupil minus the costs for the pensions. And that starts in 2005 at about $6,900, $7,000, $72, $73, $74, $73, $73, $70, $7,000, $7,000, $7,000, and $7,200 for the next projected year. This is in real dollars, so it doesn't account for inflation, which has been averaging 1 or 2% over time. So to give you a context, this projected increase of $7,028 to $7,222 is actually lower than you would get if you were controlling for inflation. So that additional amount is lower than the 1.5 projected inflation rate in Michigan over that time. So even the bump in funding that we see is a bump that is smaller than the money is worth less than it was before. And you can see here they've actually done it in terms of 4-year changes, 7-year changes, using the most recent year as the endpoint, and 10-year changes. So if you look at it, less local MIPSers costs, and you follow that through, it's actually negative in raw dollars for the last 4 years, for the last 7 years. It's positive over the last 10 years, but this is in real dollars. And if you realize that the actual inflation during that period was 19.4%, it's a significant drop. Again, it's about 15%. So about $1 in every 6 that was coming into the schools about a decade or a decade and a half ago is simply not there per pupil. So no matter how you calculate, and this is the House Fiscal Agency, and a House that is controlled by a Republican majority, and these are their findings on the amount. So it's pretty clear that the numbers are declining. The numbers are further declining. It's always hard to play the game of what if, but there is one other thing to keep in mind, which is what would funding have been like if other things had been kept the same and not changed. So even if all of these things had been kept the same, there are other things that have gone on that have lowered the ability, and lowered compared to what it could have been. This is a confusing chart from a group called Michigan Parents for Schools, but the reason I show it to you is to show you 2 bands, the orange band and the dark blue band. The orange band reflects outlays from what's called the school aid fund, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, which is the pot of money that funds K through 12 education in Michigan. And this pot of money is supposed to support kindergarten through 12th grade. But in the late 2000s, and then especially in the last few years, this has also been used to fund a variety of other education-related expenses, including community colleges first, then colleges and universities, and more recently pre-K as well, so pre-kindergarten education as well. And so this amount is what's been drawn off of the school aid fund. So even if nothing else had changed, this amount is what's been drawn off. So it would be here if the fund hadn't been tapped for those things. And then there are other changes in Michigan tax law that affect the way that the school aid fund gets its revenue. One of them is the Michigan business tax earmark. And if that hadn't been changed, you can actually see that the numbers would be considerably higher, by about, together, a little over that 15% that we see dropping for inflation. So not only is it not kept pace with inflation, one of the reasons is that there have been other changes in funding that have meant that either the money's gone elsewhere or the money's simply been taken away by other changes in tax law. I'm going to talk about that in more detail, but it gives you a sense of where things would have been if nothing had changed. All right. Things have changed, and this is the longest section, and the reason I want to spend a fair amount of time on this is because it's so remarkably complicated. And what I found is that when I worked on this kind of question, when I studied up to become sort of fluent in schools, when I ran for the Board of Education, I thought I understood this. The more I dive into it, the less comprehensible it is, the more complex it is. And so I've had to relearn this just in order to tell other people. I've had to go into this, but it's really important because almost nobody that I've met has a solid understanding of how things have changed and what they're. If you're in that group, amen, thank you very much. You should probably be up here because I had to learn this stuff anew. So let me talk about it. If you know all this stuff, you can kind of doze off. You can wake up in about 15 minutes. I'll snap my fingers and you can come back. But for the rest of you, it'll go the other way. I'll put you to sleep and then I'll snap my fingers and wake you up. The big year is 1994. 1994 is the year of, does anybody know?
Headley.
Well, actually, Headley was in the 70s, 78, but this was a post-Headley Proposition A. Proposition A. So this is the buzzword when you talk about changes in Michigan funding, Proposition A. Now, there have been so many propositions and other things in Michigan, but this is the one that we need to pay attention to. What I want to do is think about what happened before and what happened after. Okay, so before Proposition A, Michigan was a fairly typical state in the way it funded education. There was a small federal chunk, there was a moderately sized state chunk, and there was a big local chunk. So the federal chunk was about 4%, and it wasn't, in some ways for schools, a particularly useful 4%, because those of you who work with federal dollars know that federal dollars are almost always specifically geared toward a very specific thing. Some of this is school lunches, you can't spend it on anything other than school lunches, and so on. So this is very specific stuff, and at the time it was only about 4%. Over time, that's expanded out a little bit. It's now over 10%, thanks to the changes from what's called No Child Left Behind and Substantive Race to the Top and other subsequent changes. But still, this is very tightly controlled and limited money. So it's not what school districts can do with as they wish. The second largest category was state funding. It was about 1/3, a little bit less than 1/3. And it was a kind of mix of sales tax was the primary part, income. The lottery was a chunk of it. And then various other things, tobacco tax, alcohol tax, industrial facilities taxes, and so on. Together, these made up about 32%, and they went into something which was even at that time called the School Aid Fund, which was used to fund schools. The biggest source, however, by far, was property taxes. So those of you who lived in Michigan in the 1980s and 1990s, those of you who paid taxes here, will know that on your tax you paid a big chunk of your local tax for the local schools. And I can see some nodding. People are familiar with this. And at the time, there was real concern among some segments of the population about the size of property taxes. And in fact, when you do research, it looks like Michigan was actually slightly above, in some cases significantly above, other states in terms of how much as a share of overall taxes people paid in property taxes. Every different kind of tax has its own advantages, its own disadvantages. Property taxes hit certain people particularly hard, particularly seniors, because their housing values change faster than their income. And other people didn't like it for other reasons. So there was concern that this was not the best way to fund schools. So throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s, there was pretty significant debate about the way in which schools were funded. There was a lot of disagreement, and in fact, between 1978, when Headley was passed, and 1993, there were actually 12 different attempts to change Michigan's school funding basis. And I think you have almost every letter of the alphabet represented here from the various proposals. You can see that the margin of loss actually decreased, so that in 1993, Proposition A of 1993 only lost by 4%, whereas Proposition A of 1980 lost by a whopping 21%. You see a kind of gradual trend in that direction, but still, none of them passed. So 12 failed attempts to change Michigan schools and school funding. And then in 1993,
good question.
Yeah.
Was it an attempt to change the property tax structure? Was it an attempt to change funding?
Every possible combination that you could think of was represented among these 12. Some property tax, some school funding, some, it's everything. I mean, there's a wonderful thing online called Ballotopedia, which is sort of like a Wikipedia for elections. And if you were sleepless one night, Ballotopedia will put you to sleep because it goes through every single in excruciating. And that's actually the source of this data. So they were all there. Jim's looking at it now, about to fall asleep. So in 1993, and I'm still trying to sort of figure out the actual workings of the story, but as I understand it, I talked to Walt Herzig, who I think has some institutional knowledge. He worked in the governor's office shortly after this. After a lot of controversy about how high property taxes were and the burden that people faced by paying property taxes for schools, a Democratic state legislator named Debbie Stabenow actually proposed a bill, really to sort of call the bluff of the other side, to say, fine, you don't want to use local tax revenues to pay for schools? Fine, we'll get rid of it. The other side called her bluff, calling their bluff, and they actually passed it without any alternative funding plan. So this entire segment, 64% of the total education funding in Michigan, disappeared like that. Now that actually wasn't a signal to wake up, you can stay asleep, but it was gone. And so they had to quickly fill that enormous hole. Not a particularly sort of left-leaning periodical was horrified at what this was. I mean, it was really a kind of, both sides calling each other's bluff. So, what did they do? What they did was to provide two alternatives. So, on the one hand, a proposition went to the voters, a very complicated proposition. On the other hand, there was a statutory alternative. So that if this failed, then this would be the answer. This relied mainly on a combination of a lot of income tax, a little bit of sales tax. That would have supplemented and filled out that space, pretty much supplementing what was gone. This is a lot more complicated. This actually is what voters ended up voting for. So more than 2/3 of the voters actually supported it when they went to the polls, and it won in every single county. Wow. One of the reasons it won in every single county was that it made an enormous number of compromises, an enormous number of sort of log rolling to make sure that everybody was going to be happy with this. They didn't want to resort to the statutory alternative. They wanted the people to finally pass something so that it would have some legitimacy, so that people would accept it. And when they did that, they made compromises. And that's the story of the next 10 minutes or so we can understand Proposition A. The big thing to know about it is that this was a huge change. This is one of the biggest changes in school funding in any state in the last 30 years, because it really changed the proposition by which we funded schools. Its underlying principles, these weren't pure, but in a sense, this is the base of the idea, is you remove property tax as the source of education funding, you replace it with state-level education funding, you deliver that funding per pupil as opposed to per district or per school, and with a few exceptions, especially at the bottom, you keep existing levels. So the schools at the very bottom, which interestingly weren't the schools we would expect. It wasn't schools like Detroit or other places with a lot of poverty, which actually had fairly high per pupil spending. It was rural districts, places like Kalkaska and other places where voters hadn't voted mills to support their schools. These were the places that were actually moved up consistently. So the very bottom schools, largely a lot of small rural school districts were the ones that were bumped up. But other than that, there was a commitment to not cutting anybody's per pupil allowance, the amount they would get per pupil one way or the other. So it would keep it sort of revenue neutral in a sense. This is theory. In reality, they did end up with some property tax. They did end up having not all states, some local taxes. There were funds that didn't just follow the student, but follow the district or follow the school. And not all of those levels stayed the way that they were before. So those are the principles. Let's look at how it actually happened. And the first thing to know is that the actual amount didn't change very much. So Proposition A went from before to after without actually doing a huge change in how much money was being spent on education. So the changes were relatively little, and this difference is largely in the topping up of those smaller underfunded school districts. And there were quite a few of them, but they were relatively small. Where the change really happened was in the distribution. So if this is before and this is after, you can see a big difference. The state goes from about 1/3 to about 4/5, and localities go from about 2/3 to about 1/5. So it really changes the way that education is funded. What I want to do for a minute is to just look at that state source. So I'll take each source in turn. Not really going to talk about the federal sources because those stayed pretty much the same with the same restrictions, the same relatively small size. But let's look at the states and localities. So the state composed about 80% of the total funding. And that amount, when we look at it overall, compared to 32% before, and it came from different sources, and it went to its destinations in different ways. So I want to talk about where that came from and where it went to. So, the new sources of the state aid fund, which is considerably larger than it was before, the way they filled up that new, much larger bucket was in particular through an increase in the sales tax. And those of you who lived in Michigan in the 1990s, 1994, will remember that sales tax went from 4% to 2%, or from 6%. And that additional 2% all went into the school aid fund. And that made a total of about 50%, actually slightly less than 50%. Because in addition to the 46% here, there's 3% that's done in the form of a sales tax called the use tax. So I'm wondering if anybody here's paid their use tax lately. Anybody know what their use tax is? Any idea? Jim knows what the use tax. Anybody buy from Amazon?
Yeah, that's what I thought it was.
Yeah, anybody pay taxes on what they buy from Amazon?
No,
that's the reason why people buy from Amazon. But the state actually expects that you pay that.
Yeah.
Right? And so what you are supposed to do, if you have anything coming from out of state, from out of the country, from another planet, anything, you're supposed to pay 6%. You're supposed to actually register to the state and pay that 6% to the state. Not a lot of people do it. It's about 3% of the total, and I think that's primarily business related and those who have registered for this, which is a relatively small percentage. If you're feeling particularly patriotic, if you're feeling particularly civic, know that if you do decide to pay those particular fees, which the state wants you to do anyway, that it goes straight into the school aid fund. So it comes right back into the community. It pays for schools. The next category, 20%. About 20% of the new state aid fund is paid for with income tax. So about 1/5. And about 18% is paid for in terms of property-related taxes. I'm going to come back to this, but it is notable that in order to fill up this new amount, the state had to create a new tax, a new kind of tax, a state property tax, which is pretty unusual. Normally, in most places, property taxes are local taxes, other kinds of taxes are state or federal taxes. But in this case, the state creates a state property tax, and that state property tax is used to fund this amount. And that's about 15% of this, and the remainder is what's called the real estate transfer tax. So whenever you buy or sell a home, a small amount of that total sale goes into the state aid fund as well. It's interesting, though, that both that real estate transfer tax and the sales tax, which compose the bulk of the state aid fund, these are very recession-sensitive methods of getting revenue. When people don't have as much money, they don't spend as much, they don't buy and sell their houses as much, or the property values drop radically, so the amount that they sell their house for is much smaller. And so when the economy falls, these fall as well. Now, they don't fall as much as property tax, but they do fall, and they are fairly sensitive to that. And then at the top, we've got the lottery and casino. Lottery is about 6% overall, casinos over 1%. A lot of people think that the lottery funds the schools in Michigan, and they do, but only to the tune of about 6%. Now, the way the lottery bills itself, you know, a lot of lottery money goes to the schools. What people seem to think is that a lot of school money comes from the lottery. The first is true, the second is not. So it's only about 6%. The lotteries only fund a tiny bit of the schools, which is probably a good thing, since, as I've talked with some of you, the lotteries are a tax on those people who haven't gotten a particularly good education in math in the first place. So this is a kind of related phenomenon. And then finally, about 3% is tobacco taxes, and about 1% is other industrial facilities taxes and other things. So this together, this is the full basis. And if you want to think about it in relatively simple terms, about half is sales tax, about a fifth is income and property, and then about 1/10 is related to various risky behaviors, whether you're betting on your wallet or you're betting on your lungs. Those are the full basis. Let's look at local distribution. And again, it goes from 2/3 to under 1/5. So I want to look at that. Here's where it gets really complicated. Because before Proposition A, taxes were levied by localities in varying amounts. The average amount was about 34 mils. So about $34 on every $1,000 of valuation was the amount that you would pay for schools. But it varied from some communities where it was considerably higher to other communities where it was considerably lower. One of the big reasons for doing Proposition A in the first place was property tax relief. And so it's not a surprise that afterward you get a significant drop. But that significant drop is then bifurcated. They make two separate categories. One category is for homestead, and the other is non-homestead. This simply means your primary residence, the one where you live. Non-homestead is everything else. So it's your second home, it's rental properties that you own, it's farmland, it's business properties, and so on. These fall in the category of non-homestead. So after Proposition A, taxes on non-homestead are reduced to 6 mils, and taxes on homestead are reduced to 6 mils. Taxes on non-homestead are capped at 24 mils. But it gets more complicated than that. Because as I said, actually, the state had created this new category of a state property tax. So when you are paying property tax, when you see on your property tax bill, state education tax 6 mil, that money actually goes straight to the state. It's not a local tax. It comes to you with your local tax bill on your local property, but it doesn't stay there. It goes straight to the state. What that means is that there is a remaining 18 mils on non-homestead property, which is collected by localities for schools. So this is the primary source of local revenue per school. And you might think that so localities have some control over their school funding. They have this 18 mils to play with. The problem is, from a local choice perspective, localities cannot go above that. There is simply no way to tax a non-homestead property locally more than 18 mils. So that's completely out. You can tax less, but if you tax less, it's not made up in any other form. So you have to make a conscious decision to tax less. And to my knowledge, this is highly unusual. In fact, I can't think of one offhand, but it's very rare for a school district not to tax to the full 18. Especially because it's non-homestead tax. It's not people's individual home. So the amount of control you have is sharply limited. I want to put in a note here that this tax, this non-homestead tax, has to be renewed at some regularity. I think it can't be more than 20 years. And Ferndale's non-homestead millage was about 20 years ago. So within the next 2 years, it was about 18 years ago, within the next 2 years, the Ferndale Public School District will have to make a decision about whether to ask its voters to renew that 18 mils. This is something that, to my knowledge, every single school district does, and it is something that you should therefore expect to encounter. And this is something that you're going to see. It's almost never rejected. I can't think of a single rejection by voters because it forms the core of school funding. But it is something that everyone in this room is gonna see. So, back to this broader question, there is also this other question. What's really sort of notable about Proposition A is that on homestead properties, localities are permitted to tax exactly 0 mills for operations, for classroom functions, for the kinds of things that go from the day-to-day operation of the district. 0 mills, with 3 exceptions. So I want to talk about those 3 exceptions, and they're very limited cases. So these are the 3. One is called hold harmless, one is about debt, and one is called the sinking fund. So let me first actually talk quickly about hold harmless, and I want to do a little interlude here about what a hold harmless district is. How many people here have heard the phrase hold harmless? So about half the people here have heard this hold harmless. A hold harmless district is a district in the state of Michigan, and there are about 50 out of the 550 some districts in Michigan. It is a district that is allowed to tax its own voters to a certain limited degree for operations. And it happened in this way. When Proposition A came about, the state set a maximum that it would fund per pupil, $6,500 at the time. Any district that had an amount below that would be capped at that way. That they would only be able to get operating funds from the state, from no other source. But there were about 50 districts that were actually above that $6,500 cap. Ferndale was not one of them. But there were about 50 others. And what the state decided to do was, in those cases, to allow those districts to tax themselves the additional amount. So those districts were so-called held harmless because their amounts weren't reduced as long as their voters said yes. So this is the situation. When you hear people talk about educational inequality, there are certain other complexities in this, but the state funding in Michigan is capped at a certain amount. The amount you get from the state is actually related almost entirely to what you were getting in 1994. The rough ranking of districts to one another hasn't changed since 1994. It's compressed quite a bit, but it hasn't changed that much. The bottom's been brought up, but the top hasn't necessarily been brought down, at least not very much. And so you get districts, some districts that are getting the state minimum pupil allowance, which is just over $7,000. And some that are in the $11,000 range. The ones that get $11,000 are taxing themselves, though. They are getting voters to do it. Now, again, voters almost always approve these. There are a few cases where voters say no, but not that many. This is a particularly sensitive question for Ferndale because in an environment of a lot of students of choice, where schools can recruit other students and schools are competing on the basis of scores and really the kinds of amenities they can offer, how much money you have in your fund balance and your per pupil allowance makes a difference. And Ferndale, which is, if this is Oakland County down there, the Ferndale School District is surrounded by hold harmless districts. So almost every district around Ferndale, with the exception of Oak Park, Hazel Park, Madison Schools, Berkeley, and Clawson, with those 5 exceptions, none of which are particularly wealthy places, maybe with the exception of Berkeley, all of those places are hold harmless districts. And so some, including places like Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills, have significantly higher per pupil allowances than Ferndale. And it makes a difference. So let me go back, get out of the interlude. So we can't do this one. Ferndale simply doesn't have that choice. We can't tax our voters for additional funds for operations. The second one is bond. So state law allows local districts at an amount limited by property values and the changes in property values over time to ask voters for a millage that would pay for repayment of debt, bond debt. So most of the people in this room know that in 2012, the Ferndale School District did just this. We went to the voters and asked for millages up to a certain amount, and that amount is capped, that would provide the school district with just over $20 million that we used for particular specific projects. Removing the asbestos in the high school, redoing the high school auditorium, redoing the heating and cooling in virtually every building, asphalt, fences, other things, playgrounds and so on. But these have to be specific capital projects. It has to be spent exactly as we say, and it has to be done in a relatively short period of time. And once you've done it, you can't do it again until you've paid off your bonds. So we've now done this. We had some good news last week, actually. We were able to refund a couple of previous bonds and save $1.2 million, where we thought we were only going to save about $800,000. So that time of repayment is nearer than it was, but it's still pretty far out there. And so this is not an immediate option. We've done this. We've been there, we've done it. It's making our schools better, but we don't have that option again for the near future. So the only option left to a district like Ferndale is what's called a sinking fund, which is a name that is just designed to fail, right? This is the Titanic of school funding options. But at least theoretically, a district can go to its voters and ask for a sinking fund millage. A sinking fund millage is like a bond, but it's not about debt. It's about actually saving the money. So the money comes in, you put it in an account, and you can use it to do capital repairs as they occur. So if a boiler were to go, we're fixing all the boilers, but if a boiler were to go, if a roof were to cave in, if a parking lot were to have severe problems, we could use the money from the sinking fund instead of taking it out of classroom operations. So there are some who are proposing that the district try this. There are others who say no. This is going to be something that's going to be on our agenda for the next few years as we think and talk about it. But it's honestly, whether we do it or not, it's the only option left. We have almost no options as a local district. Almost all of our money comes from the state, and that's it. What comes from the state comes from the state. If you're not a hold harmless district and you've already done your bonds, which almost every district has, that's about it. So the only way to change your revenue is to change your number of pupils. And that's not always a great option either. So we have to talk and think about that. So that's where the money comes from. What you've seen is that it's really limited. And the combination of local and state money produces the full amount that yields the per pupil allowance. And that local money is actually deducted from the state money. So the state will give X amount minus the amount that you bring in with your local mills, as long as it's at that 18 level. And so really, while this looks like a significant chunk for local control, it's not. It's simply part of a much larger state fund. Where does it go? Well, it really takes two forms. Part of it goes in the form of the per pupil allowance. Those are the numbers that I showed you before. And part of it in the form of categoricals. Categoricals resemble, in a sense, the federal aid that I talked about above, because it's state money geared towards specific outlays. Specific outlays like special education. Specific outlays like students from disadvantaged environments, and so on. So there are very specific ways that this money can be spent. It's a very small proportion of the overall funding from the state aid fund. To a certain extent, because it goes to some students with greater needs, students for whom the expenditure to reach the same levels is greater. It compensates districts for having more students who cost more to educate, but there is some question about whether it goes to the full extent to actually do that. So this is the situation, this is where it goes. It comes back almost entirely in terms of that per pupil allowance with some other categories thrown in. And that's the Proposition A story. I want to do three other things, and then I'm going to shut up and let all of you ask questions. Question of why the funding stays. Here I don't want to talk about the politics, but I want to talk about the mechanics. So what's actually happened to make this change? I've alluded to this above. The first one is that there have been reductions in specific sources of revenue. So if this is the source of revenue for the state aid fund, these things have changed over time. Anytime the state makes a law about what is or isn't included in sales tax, for example, anytime it makes a law about what is or isn't included in real estate tax, or what is or isn't done with tobacco tax, anytime it makes a law like that, it affects the state aid fund. And what's been going on over the last 10 years is that there have been a significant number of changes in the sales tax and related taxes that actually reduce the number of things that Michigan taxes. with sales tax. To give the most recent example, the state has decided that when automobiles are traded in the past, you would pay sales tax on the difference between your trade-in value and the new car that you're getting. Legislation decided that instead that would not be taxed, that wouldn't be part of it because it was a trade-in. That actually affects the amount because you aren't taxing that money, so that money doesn't go into the state aid fund. Likewise, there is a proposal on the table to shift the way we tax aviation fuel, which you wouldn't think is a very big amount, but given the size of Metro Airport and a couple of other airports, it's actually a big chunk of money. Currently, that's taxed as a retail product. It's taxed in terms of sales. There's a proposal to change the way it's taxed, potentially yielding the state more revenue, but only by taking it out of the sales tax column. If you take it out of the sales tax column, maybe the state gets the revenue in some other fund, the general fund, but it doesn't get it here. It doesn't get it in the state aid fund. And so anytime you mess with any of this, it affects this. And there have been a whole series of cuts. Karen Toomey's documented this for some information we're taking to Lansing. There have been lots of cuts to this over, and it's nickel and diming cuts, piece here, piece there, and so on. Second thing is diversion of funding away from kindergarten through 12. So you take the state aid fund, but then you spend it on things that are not kindergarten through 12. And in particular, you take this, and you pay the per pupil allowance and categoricals and pre-K and colleges and universities and community colleges. So some of this goes away. So you get a shrinking amount going in, and you get an increasing diversion of that amount going out. The third reason, as I've alluded to, are increases in pension costs, but not only pension costs, healthcare costs. I think all of you know that education is one of the most labor-intensive, human-intensive industries that there is. Because no matter what you do, you have a classroom full of children, and you need to staff that with a qualified teacher. So in the Ferndale School District, an enormous part of our budget is simply paying the well-earned salaries of our teachers, administrators, staff, and so on. As long as that involves healthcare, and as long as healthcare is going up faster than inflation, it means that even if you kept school amounts, even if you kept school expenditures at the inflation level, you would still have less and less in the classroom because an increasing amount of that is going to healthcare costs, which at least until recently have been expanding faster than inflation. So you really have to think of not just the inflation level in general, but the inflation level for the kinds of things that schools do, that schools need, which is higher than the actual overall level of inflation. So schools get hit harder in that way. And so it shrinks even further because this money is not only going to K through 12, but it's going to pensions, and it's going to increase health expenditures. And then finally, there are costs related to choice. Michigan has one of the most open choice environments of any state. Local districts compete with other districts for students. In part, they compete with other districts for students because that's the only way to increase their revenue. So they not only can by law, but they want to. If your funding comes from your local district, you don't have that much of incentive to pull students from elsewhere. But if your money follows the student, then you want to pull in as many of those students as you can to increase your revenue. At least that's the theory. But that has enormous costs for districts. In part, it has a cost of marketing. Schools are forced to become essentially for-profit or not-for-profit organizations that have to have strong marketing wings, and our district is no exemption. And we've actually we've started to do that as well by hiring a marketing consultant and working with retention specialists and so on. So you have costs related to that. And there's another cost that is really very significant, and that is this. The money coming in follows the students. Students move rather rapidly. The expenditures going out go to teachers, they go to buildings, those things don't move. So you get high variability in your revenue stream. It can be big one year, small the next year, and low variability in your expenditure. Your expenses stay pretty much the same year after year, but your revenues can go way up or they can go way down. If you live in a district out in the rim that's sort of tax subsidized for development, and you see a lot of people moving in, it's not such a big deal. It can be an advantage. But if you live in a community with stable population growth, like Ferndale, like Pleasant Ridge, you don't have that kind of option. So you've got to figure out a way to draw the students in, or at least to keep the students from leaving, so that your revenues don't drop below your fixed costs. This isn't just our district complaining about a situation. What's really significant to me is that the people who figure out how likely you are to pay back your bonds, these aren't education, these aren't teachers, these aren't unions. These are just hard-headed accountants who want to know, is District X going to pay back its money? These groups, like Moody's, report that districts like ours are strained by this intense choice environment and a system where the money follows the students instead of following the district or the district's needs. And Michigan is one of the only states in the country where there is no state supplement that deals with facilities. Almost every other state has some kind of state fund that deals with schools' facilities. In certain Michigan districts, no matter how high they were to issue bonds or other things, there's simply not enough money to actually pay for the facilities that are there. And then the situation is worse when students leave, but the districts are saddled with the same properties that they had before. So this is a big deal. Yes?
If you took out the schools of choice pressure, would you still have that for populations that are aging?
You certainly would, but
you're not going to have as many schools.
Yes, but when populations age, they age in predictable ways and they age slowly. So you can make estimates about how many schools you're going to need, and you can figure out how to dispose of your property. No one's saying that schools shouldn't be smart about how they dispose of their property. What they're saying is it's hard to be really smart when you don't know next year what that's going to be. If you have too many schools or not enough schools, you can fix that in the medium term. But you can't fix it in the short term. Or if you fix it in the short term and then realize you need it back next year, it's a problem. Mary Schusterbauer, who used to be on the school board, pointed out that in the early 2000s, a charter school opened up in what used to be St. James School. A lot of students went there. There was a significant drop in enrollment in the district. And then when they realized the quality, they moved back. So if you've made a decision about selling a school or closing a school on the basis of that short-term change, and then they come back, then you're in a situation figuring out how you're going to do it again, how you're going to reverse the situation. So it puts a big. Schools are in the situation of having to act like companies in terms of dealing with their revenues, and having to act like post offices in terms of having a lot of fixed facilities all over the place. So, last thing that I want to talk about. Why is this significant? I think it's arguable, although we'll see, that there probably wasn't enough money in the first place. And when Proposition A was implemented, Proposition A distinctly did not ask the question, is this enough to fund education? Proposition A asked the question, how much were you getting before? If you were below a certain level, they raised you up, and that's it. Everybody else was kept the same. So there was no inquiry about whether this was enough then. And so it may well not be enough for many schools now. Even if it was enough, there's less of it now than there was before. And this is a big deal. To the extent, and I know there's disagreement about this, but to the extent that money and funding are important for the quality of education, there's less of that to go around because the per pupil allowance is falling. It's not falling this year because it's an election year. But even in inflation-adjusted terms, it isn't going up. It's not changing. So this is what Ferndale District has faced over the last 10 to 15 years. And in some circumstances, maybe that's not a problem, but in the kinds of things that schools do, the kinds of things that education systems do, I think you can argue at the very least there are considerably more stresses and strains on the system than there were before. And the real problem here is that the district can't ask you for more. At least not for operations, and it now can't ask you for more for facilities unless they go to the sinking fund option because those options simply aren't there. And so in order to get more, you've got to ask someone else. We've got to go to Lansing, we've got to do something else, but we can't ourselves increase operations funding. So last question, what can you do? This is actually something that I think we can talk about as a group, and there are lots of different answers. There are lots of different ways of understanding this problem, this question, and lots of different answers on all the various sides of the various political aisles. But I think the one thing that maybe you can do best is what you've already done, which is to take an interest in understanding how funding works, and then from that, we can have a discussion about what happens next. So that's all I want to say now, but I'm really curious if you have any questions or any thoughts, and we might as well open it for questions. Yeah.
Are there other states that fund schools with sales tax?
It plays a varying role in most states, but my understanding is that we are certainly among the highest, if not the highest, in funding it that way. And certainly in the following the pupil model as opposed to staying in the district model, it's a question. Now, I mean, I have to say, from an equity perspective, I think both sides would say that Proposition A has actually worked in that regard. I mean, you had a lot of very poor school districts in Michigan, and now almost all school districts are at that state minimum, but the bulk, I think about half of all the districts in the state, I've got the numbers here, I think about half of all the districts in the state are at that state minimum. And so it's really compressed that range. The top end hasn't been affected, but the bottom end has been brought up. Because a lot of states, there is no per pupil thing. But when you do per pupil, you introduce other problems, like the student mobility problem and other things. And if the amount per pupil isn't enough, then you've got big problems. So a community like this one, I suspect, would be fairly willing to fund its students. If we could fund operations with a millage, I suspect the case could be made, at least it would be a fair bet about whether this community would support higher education taxes. That would help this community, but it wouldn't help others. So it's a mixed bag. What's currently being proposed, at least by our local representative, Ellen Kogan-Lipton, is to do a study on the lines of studies done in Pennsylvania and Maryland, and to a certain degree in 28 other different places, about how much it actually costs to educate a student. Because this per pupil thing could work if you could figure out how to handle the choice problem, which you could do with some facilities compensation, some other stuff, and if you could make sure that it was actually enough. But right now we don't know, and there's been some opposition to this bill, I'm afraid, from those who don't really want to know, because the number that's going to come back is certainly going to be higher than what it is now. At least Pennsylvania's number that came back is higher than what Michigan does in its per pupil allowance.
What is Pennsylvania's number?
I only have Pennsylvania's number. Study was done in 2007, so I would have to compare it then. But the Pennsylvania number in 2007 was, I think, about $1,000 higher than what Michigan was spending at the time. But I can check that. I should know that off the top of my head. Yeah.
Why wasn't there any effort, or is it even a possibility to tap something like tobacco settlement money? Or
some of that, I think, a lot of that went into it went into the scholarships for college, I think, is where it went. I mean, the other problem with that is, to the extent that that's time limited, you don't want to sort of build a time limited thing into your education. What we saw actually during 2009, 10, and 11 was that federal funds from the ARRA, the Recovery Act, came in to sort of supplement dropping state revenues in the school aid fund. When that went away, then we saw the drop in the school aid fund, because all it did was to sort of delay the drop. So there is I would have a kind of fear that some of the tobacco settlement, to the extent that it diminishes over time, that some of that money would actually give an excuse in the beginning to sort of replace that amount with something else, and then as that declines, you don't fill it up with something else.
Right back where you
You'd be right back where you started. Yeah.
A couple of things. One is, what is the legal relationship between a community and the school district? Is there, because I'm thinking of a money laundering kind of an idea.
You're on television.
I know. Yeah. Because could you increase the taxes at the community level and use that to fund some aspect of school districts? I know the answer is no, but generally speaking, but are there loopholes?
I have to say, they aren't ones that I've looked into for good reason, probably. It would actually be particularly problematic here because this school district is not coterminous, with the exception of Pleasant Ridge, with any of its residents. So we have a district that contains all of Pleasant Ridge, part of Ferndale, part of Oak Park, and part of Royal Oak Township.
Mm-hmm.
So in no case except for Pleasant Ridge do any of the communities actually all pay into the same amount. So you'd have to sort of get Pleasant Ridge and Ferndale and Oak Park and Royal Oak Township to do it, and then they actually have a tax base that would be paying for one district and not another. So I love the idea, but I don't know
But
how.
that is partly a real proposal, the idea of district consolidation.
Well, and that's certainly, and
Changing
that's an
the school
idea.
district.
So I mean, the state can do it when states get into deep financial, when districts get into deep financial trouble. There is the option of doing that. In a couple of cases, districts have voluntarily chosen to merge. So Ypsilanti and Washington, I'm trying to think. Willow Run have actually merged. So we're going to see, what kind of an experiment that is. It turns out it's actually shockingly hard to consolidate. There are expenses in consolidation. Those expenses aren't supported by the state. So the state, which wants to encourage consolidation, actually isn't putting any money where its mouth is in that regard. What seems to be happening instead of actual district consolidation is consolidation of service provision. So removing the necessity of a district to provide its own accounting, its own HR, and so on. So what you get is something that districts have control over their own curriculum, but don't necessarily have control over their own, or at least contract out for the other services that they do. So in that sense, I mean, it's a sort of de facto consolidation in certain areas where local control isn't that important. But it's only, it's a partial option. We may see consolidation in the long run anyway, and certainly some other states have moved in that direction. The problem with consolidation, though, is it adds another layer of bureaucracy. And so there are real questions, I think, among the public administration people who study this about whether consolidation in the long run saves money. I don't know.
This may be a dumb question, but do the charter schools get that per pupil amount?
The charter schools get the minimum per pupil amount. So in that sense, the charter schools aren't in the hold harmless range. They're actually lower in the per pupil amount than Ferndale. But there are certain things that charter schools don't have to do that school districts have to do. So their costs are also lower, including MIPSR's contributions and other things. So one of the other proposals that Representative Lipton has made is actually suggesting that there are a variety of, the differences that are there actually accrue in the end in favor of the charter schools rather than the districts. So they get the minimum, something very near the minimum, but other things are lower as well, not because they're cheaper. And what's really interesting is that when you look at the way schools spend money, it turns out that charter schools actually spend a significantly higher percentage of their money on administration than
right.
local districts. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot bigger. But there are things they don't have to do, and that lowers their costs. And so there's more money available, arguably, for those schools in the classroom. Does that get a question? Yeah.
So based on your presentation, it would be my guess that like lobbying tomorrow and what school districts and parents and everyone's teachers are lobbying for is actually more per pupil spending. But is anyone also arguing over in the longer term for more stable sources of revenue rather than recession-proof?
That's what we're doing. So we're going to Lansing. So the Ferndale Community District is going to Lansing tomorrow, and we have 3 legislative priorities. The first is to support Representative Kogan-Lipton's bill on figuring out how much it actually costs. So having a baseline, there's no business in the world that would operate without knowing how much its product costs. So that's the first one. The second one is to restore funding to previous levels. And the third one is to protect the integrity of the school aid fund, so that that fund isn't nickel and dime and it stays its size regardless of external circumstances. So, I mean, that's the kind of broader framework, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. It doesn't do any good to get it to a certain amount and then have it fall back. So you need to do exactly what you said. You need to build in much more stable revenue sources to make sure that that continues over time. And this, I mean, this is something that we do. And I mean, it's interesting that Dan DeGros, who was a state legislator from the Port Huron area, who's now the head of the intermediate school district in St. Clair County, has said of all the things we do, we need to fund this one because this is the most important thing that we do as a state. It's educating our kids. It's a long-term investment. You don't see the payoff right away, but that this in the long run is the most important for whatever side of the political aisle you're on. So we need to make sure that's stable. Any other questions? Nothing? I have bored you all into utter submission. Yeah, oh, that's okay. You can wake up now. It's all been a dream, and funding was just fine.
Great charts.
I wish it were. Thank you very much as an audience. And any questions, any thoughts? I will do this presentation for anyone at any time. Wherever 2 or more people are gathered who want to know about school funding, I will go there. I make house calls. I so passionately want people to know how this works so that they can start to think well about what we do next. So let me know, and I'll go wherever I'm needed. Thanks, appreciate it. Thank you.